Hello class and welcome to week 4 of MCAA 561. This week we'll be covering chapter 4, which is Dynamic Fundraising Essentials and Principles. And I'd like to take some time to cover the main ideas for this chapter so that you have all the resources necessary as you begin planning your second essay. So let's get started. My goal for this chapter is to focus on 3 areas that will be most beneficial to your writing assignment this week. First off, let's look at the purpose of this chapter, which is to identify and explain the substantial principles and models in successful sports fundraising. And hopefully you'll get an opportunity to see these as you look closer in the reading. As I said before, I'm going to cover the basic fundamentals of fundraising, the Rosso LAI principle, the fundraising cycle, and the 90-10 principle. And then I'm going to finish with the biblical application and the parable of the talents. We don't often get an opportunity in a class like this to share some biblical principles, and I think the parable of the talents has some application to this chapter, especially in regard to our work lives and stewardship. The beginning of the chapter identifies some of the fundraising fundamentals, which are planning and goal setting, identifying and targeting this constituency, rallying support and involvement, organizing and managing time, money, and resources, and evaluating results. I'm not going to cover these topics in our presentation. I'll let you look at these at the reading, and if you have any questions, you can contact me. I'd like to focus on one of the main ideas, which is the Rosso LAI principle, because I think this would be valuable in your future as an athletic leader in fundraising, and especially as it applies to this week's writing assignment. So the Rosso LAI principle focuses on 3 main areas with regard to fundraising, and that is linkage, ability, and interest. So let's start with linkage, which refers to the human connection that the prospect may have with the organization, and that is the face-to-face contact or in-person or more personal contact that we can supply as the organization or the leaders of the organization to an individual. Ability would refer to the financial ability of the prospects to give at the levels being sought. And then interest would be the degree to which the prospect is interested in becoming involved in the organization. Henry Hank Rossi is the founding father of ethical and philanthropic fundraising, and he basically came up with this idea so that we have a better ability to classify how we go about our fundraising needs. It's good fundraising practice to identify and then target those who display all of these criteria, but that would require us to assess each of these individual areas. And so you can use a scoring system. In the textbook, it talks about a scoring system 1 through 5, which help to quantify the criteria and then lead to more reliable decision making. So let's start how we would classify linkage. With linkage, I would say that you would rate the past giving behavior of the prospect and their ability or the relationship to the organization. And again, you can use a 5-point system that they recommend in the book or another system. But again, you're looking at past giving behavior when you're trying to quantify linkage. With ability, it can be quantified among a range of money giving levels. So you could classify 5 different levels of giving, and then you could rate prospects or prospective donors in those 5 areas. And then lastly, with interest, you could classify them as number 1, someone who has little or no interest or knowledge. You could classify them as number 2, minimal involvement, which would mean one-time attendance at a sporting event. Number 3 could be moderate interest, occasional attendance at a sporting event, or limited involvement with the booster club or fundraising activities. Number 4 would be moderate involvement, which is frequently attending sporting events and or connection with a booster club member, which would be moderate involvement in fundraising activities. And then 5 would be active involvement, which would be like a season ticket holder, someone who has regular attendance at sporting events, and they are actively involved as a booster member and or volunteering for the fundraising activities. One thing to remember is that the financial context would determine the scale as you look at the classifications between 1 through 5. Colleges will be much different than high schools or youth programs. Someone who is quantified as a 5 in a college may not be the same as a high school. So you'd have to look at that, I think, depending on the level you're at. And then one other thing it mentions in the textbook that it's important is that you should look for at least 50% to be met by how you quantify your prospective donors in order to cultivate them further. So at least if you're using 5 points and you have these 3 different areas, you have a total of 15 points. You're looking for at least a 7.5 or above in order to further cultivate a donor. The next area I'm going to focus on is the fundraising cycle. The fundraising cycle refers to our ability to develop the constituency, to cultivate the donor, to make the ask and get the gift, to steward the donor, and then to renew the gift and repeat the process. So as we look at the very beginning to develop this constituency, we want to bring those interested closer to the mission of the sport organization. Anytime we can connect people to our vision and the underlying principles of what drives us as an organization, you have a better opportunity to get them to buy in to what you're trying to do. You also want to bring the volunteer base together, and this is important because they can help you plan, especially in the initial stages. And you also want to give them a voice in the planning process. And then what you hear from them, you can incorporate into the plan. The second thing in terms of cultivating the donor, it is an ongoing process that involves building a positive relationship with each donor. And it is encouraged to use existing centers of influence. Centers of influence would be prospects that are already classified as donors, people who are would be considered more important than others. So, for example, the athletic director could be a center of influence, and his role or her role could play a major impact or have a major impact on how or what is given to an organization. Other large donors could serve as this as well because they're already have become part of the organization and believe in the mission and vision, and then can communicate that to potential donors. The third area is make the ask and get the gift, and this would be personal visits by already committed donors. Again, as I talked about in the centers of influence, those people already have a connection to the organization, and so using them to make personal visits to potential donors is a great way to finalize this aspect of getting the gift. And face-to-face contact cannot be underestimated. It is the most effective form of communication and cannot be overlooked. It's always best to make a face-to-face contact when you have the opportunity, especially as you're looking at large donors or members in the community who have a lot of impact or could have a lot of impact in your school. And then stewarding the donor, I would say this is important because once we get potential donors and we can identify who they might be, having an ethical accountability, or also described in the textbook as building relationship strategies that encourage future giving, is also something that cannot be overlooked. Once we get a person to donate, we cannot see this as a business transaction. It must be personalized. So our stewardship has to connect with that person or those persons once they become donors to the organization. Once the gift has been made, major donors should not be treated just as a number. We really have to do a good job of being creative and reaching out to these people. And so keeping them in the loop, whether it's through newsletters or other ways to communicate with them. But you want to be able to show them how their gift is being used positively in the organization so that you can encourage giving in the future. And that leads us to renewing the gift and repeating the process. So one way to do this is to ask how you can or how they can help you engage and cultivate other donors in the fundraising endeavor. And there's a quote in the book that I felt was important to communicate here, and that's properly thanking donors, reporting the use of their gifts, and demonstrating wise stewardship of contributed funds makes renewal of the gift possible. And so all this goes back to how do you sustain giving throughout the year and also sustain giving in the years to come. The final area in the textbook that is going to apply to your writing this week is the 90-10 principle. And the 90-10 principle is in reference to the percentage of people who participate or do not participate in the fundraising campaign. And in the textbook, it lists or it states that 90% of the money in any fundraising campaign comes from 10% of the people. So the lesson to learn here is to focus on the 10%. And that requires obviously more personal attention, getting to know their background, their connection to the organization, their desires and their vision of how they see their financial contribution helping the organization. And this doesn't mean you ignore the 90%, but you just use methods that are a little more efficient in your communication. So maybe emails or listservs to the 90%, or including them in large events for the organization, so that you could then focus more of your energy and attention on the 10%. So this is a relatively simple principle. You could also see it in other areas of the fundraising as the 80-20 principle, but here in our textbook it refers to it as the 90-10 principle. Finally, let's look at a biblical application to what we discussed in this area of the chapter. I came across an article recently called 5 Lessons for Our Lives from the Parable of the Talents, and I found it to be very helpful when looking at stewardship. And as we look at fundraising and how we use our talent in service of different organizations, as Christians, we also have to look at our work as part of our calling or as our vocation. And so I really feel that this is important as a biblical principle. And I think the parable of the talents can give us some important lessons from this. So Hugh Wetzel wrote this article. I'm going to highlight some of the important areas that he discussed. It was an article that I listed the link below, and it was in the Institute for Faith, Work, and Economics. So let's read the parable first, and then I'll come back to the 5 points he discusses. The parable begins in Matthew 25, verses 14 through 30, where it states, "For it will be as when a man going on a journey called his servants and entrusted them his property. To one he gave 5 talents, and to another 2, to another 1, to each according to his ability. Then he went away. He who had received the 5 talents went at once and traded with them, and he made 5 talents more. So also he who had the 2 talents made the 2 talents more. But he who had received the 1 talent went and dug in the ground and hid his master's money. Now after a long time the master of those servants came and settled accounts with them. And he who had received the 5 talents came forward, bringing 5 talents more, saying, Master, you delivered to me 5 talents. Here I have made 5 talents more. His master said to him, Well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful over a little time. I will set you over much. Enter into the joy of your master. And he also who had the 2 talents came forward, saying, Master, you delivered me 2 talents. Here I have made 2 talents more. His master said to him, "Well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful over a little. I will set you over much. Enter into the joy of your master." He also, who had received the 1 talent, came forward, saying, "Master, I knew you to be a hard man, reaping where you did not sow, and gathering where you did not winnow. So I was afraid, and I went and hid your talent in the ground. Here you have what is yours." But his master answered him, "You wicked and slothful servant, you knew that I reap where I have not sowed, and gather where I have not winnowed. Then you ought to have invested my money with the bankers, and at my coming I should have received what was my own with interest. So take the talent from him, and give it to him who has the 10 talents. For to everyone who has will be given more, and he will have abundance. But from him who has not, even what he has will be given or be taken away. And cast the worthless servant into the outer darkness. There men will weep and gnash their teeth." So what are we to learn from this parable? First, this parable teaches us that success is a product of our work. In the book of Genesis, we see that God placed Adam in the garden to work it and take care of it. We were made to work. As Christians, we have a mission that our Lord expects us to accomplish in the here and now. We are to work using our talents to glorify God, serve the common good, and further God's kingdom. Biblical success is working diligently in the here and now, using all the talents God has given us to produce the return expected by the master. Number 2, the parable of the talents teaches that God always gives us everything we need to do what he has called us to do. Have you ever wondered what a talent is worth in today's dollars? It is hard to know for sure, yet whatever its exact value, in the New Testament, a talent indicates a large sum of money. Maybe even as much as $1 million in today's currency. To the Jewish ears, there was a heaviness to this amount, and you can think of that in the weight of gold. We are tempted to feel sorry for the servant who received only 1 talent, but in reality, he received as much as $1 million from the master and buried it in his backyard. He was given more than enough to meet the master's expectations. Just as the master expected his servants to do more than passively preserve what has been entrusted to them, so God expects us to generate a return by using our talents toward productive ends. The servants were given enough to produce more. It is the same with the gifts God has given us. Number 3, the parable of the talents teaches us that we are not all created equal. The most overlooked part of this parable is the second half of verse 15. The master gives to each servant talents, each according to his ability. The master understood that the 1-talent servant was not capable of producing as much as the 5-talent servant. We want to protest this as unfair, yet we know this is true from our own experience. Diversity is woven into the fabric of creation. But even though we're not created equal in regard to the talents we're given, there is equality found in the parable of the talents. It comes from the fact that it takes just as much work for the 5-talent servant to produce 5 more talents as it does the 2-talent servant to produce 2 more talents. That is why the reward is given by the master in the same amount. The master measures success by degree of effort, and should we. Number 4, the parable of the talents teaches that we work for the master, not our own selfish purposes. The money that is given to the servants is not their own. The money they earn with the capital is not theirs to keep. The servants are only stewards of the master's investment, and it is the quality of their stewardship that the master seeks to measure. We should maximize the use of our talents, not for our own selfish purposes, but to honor God. We know that we work in a fallen world. Because of the curse of sin, our work will be difficult, but we should feel satisfaction and joy from doing our best with what God has given us in the place where his providence puts us, seeking to succeed in order to honor him. Number 5, the parable of the talents shows us that we will be held accountable, and this is probably the most important point of this parable. The parable of the talents is not about salvation or works righteousness, but about how we use our work to fulfill our earthly callings. It is about whole life stewardship, or stewardship with a capital S. The unfaithful steward in this parable didn't so much waste the master's money, he wasted an opportunity. As a result, he was judged wicked and lazy. We are responsible for what we do for God with what he has been given to us. We are responsible for what we do for God with what we have been given, and one day we will be held responsible. What we hear from the Master on that day is up to us. So hopefully this provides us a little insight into what we've covered this week. And when we talk about stewardship, we are looking at how we take care of what we've been blessed with, and putting a human face to our work each day is important, and not just treating people that we come across as numbers, because ultimately we want to encourage people to be a part of what we're a part of, both now and in the future. And so I think stewardship, and along these lines in terms of biblical terms, is important, and also applies to how we to the gifts that we've been given, and how we continue to cultivate our own gifts, so that we can bless others around us. Good luck this week, and I look forward to the weeks to come.